Conflict is rarely the simple story that governments and media headlines present to the public. When leaders frame rising tensions as matters of national security, they often hide the deeper forces at work: power, profit, and economic dominance. Behind every naval deployment or military warning lies a complex network of interests tied to energy markets, trade routes, strategic alliances, and regional influence. These interests shape foreign policy far more than moral arguments or public safety narratives. Nations do not invest billions in military infrastructure purely out of fear. They do so because control over global economic flows translates directly into political leverage and long term advantage. When warships move into strategic waters, they are not just symbols of defense, they are signals to competitors and allies alike that a nation intends to protect its access to resources and markets: oil, gas, rare minerals, shipping corridors, and technological supply chains are central to modern power. Whoever dominates these systems gains the ability to influence prices, restrict access, and shape the economic futures of entire regions. Military presence becomes a tool to enforce these economic priorities, turning geopolitics into an extension of market competition backed by force. This dynamic creates a dangerous illusion. The public is told that militarization keeps them safe, while the real beneficiaries remain largely invisible. Defense contractors secure massive government contracts, financial institutions profit from wartime spending, and political leaders gain leverage by appearing strong on the international stage. Meanwhile, the true costs are distributed across society through higher taxes, reduced social spending, and long term economic instability. What is sold as protection often functions as a transfer of public wealth into private hands under the banner of national interest. Power politics also thrive on creating rivals and enemies. By framing other nations as existential threats, governments justify extraordinary military budgets and emergency policies that would otherwise face public resistance. Fear becomes a political currency. It rallies domestic support, silences critics, and allows leaders to avoid addressing internal economic problems such as unemployment, inequality, and failing infrastructure. Instead of confronting these structural issues, attention is redirected outward toward foreign adversaries, turning global tension into a convenient distraction from domestic responsibility. At the international level, this competition reinforces inequality between powerful and weaker nations. Countries with large militaries can impose economic conditions, influence regional policies, and shape global institutions in their favor. Smaller or developing nations often become battlegrounds for proxy conflicts, paying the price for struggles that originate far beyond their borders. Their resources are extracted, their political systems destabilized, and their populations caught between competing powers seeking strategic advantage. Over time, this system normalizes conflict as a routine method of economic and political negotiation. Military pressure replaces diplomacy, and threats replace cooperation. Instead of building shared prosperity through trade agreements, development partnerships, and multilateral dialogue, nations rely on intimidation and force to protect their interests. This approach does not resolve underlying problems. It hardens divisions and increases the likelihood of miscalculation, escalation, and long term instability. The result is a world where security is defined not by human well being, but by dominance, where economic competition is militarized, and where international relations resemble a battlefield of interests rather than a forum for collective problem solving. When political leaders escalate tensions and move toward confrontation, they rarely bear the personal consequences of their decisions. The true burden of conflict falls on ordinary people, workers, families, students, and vulnerable communities who have little influence over foreign policy but are deeply affected by its outcomes. While elites operate from secure offices and insulated institutions, everyday citizens experience the economic, social, and psychological costs that come with militarization and international instability. One of the most immediate impacts is financial. Military buildup and overseas deployments require enormous public spending. These funds do not appear from nowhere. They are drawn from national budgets funded by taxpayers. Money that could have been invested in schools, hospitals, housing, and infrastructure is redirected toward weapon systems, military logistics, and security operations. For working families already struggling with rising living costs, this shift means fewer public services, higher taxes, and reduced social support. In this way, war preparation quietly drains resources from the very people it claims to protect. Conflict and geopolitical tension also disrupt economies at a broader level. Trade routes become unstable, energy prices fluctuate, and markets respond with uncertainty. When fuel prices rise due to regional instability, transportation and food costs increase, affecting households across income levels. Small businesses face higher operating expenses, farmers struggle with supply chain disruptions, and workers experience job insecurity as industries respond to global shocks. These economic ripples do not stay confined to the battlefield. They spread into everyday life, shaping the cost of living and long term financial stability. Beyond economics, there is a heavy social and emotional toll. Communities with military members face prolonged separations, anxiety, and uncertainty. Families worry about the safety of loved ones, children grow up under the shadow of conflict narratives, and entire societies become conditioned to accept fear as normal. Media coverage filled with threats and military imagery creates a climate of tension that affects mental health and public discourse, reinforcing stress and polarization rather than understanding and cooperation. In regions directly affected by conflict or military presence, the consequences are even more severe. Civilians face displacement, disrupted education, damaged infrastructure, and limited access to basic services. Refugee populations grow, placing pressure on neighboring countries and humanitarian systems. These individuals did not choose geopolitical rivalries, yet they are forced to rebuild their lives around decisions made by distant political and military leaders. The long term effects can persist for generations. Economic setbacks caused by conflict reduce opportunities for young people, weaken public institutions, and slow national development. Societies recovering from prolonged tension often struggle to rebuild trust, attract investment, and stabilize political systems. Even countries not directly involved in fighting experience the indirect consequences through global economic instability and rising international polarization. What makes this reality especially troubling is the imbalance of accountability. Those who promote aggressive policies often avoid responsibility when consequences unfold. Ordinary people with no control over diplomatic negotiations or military strategy are left to absorb the damage. They pay through taxes, reduced public services, emotional stress, and diminished economic opportunities. becoming the invisible casualties of power struggles carried out in their name. Militarization thrives on a cycle of fear that feeds itself. When one nation increases its military presence, rivals interpret the move as a threat, even if it is officially described as defensive. In response, they strengthen their own forces, conduct military exercises, or issue warnings of retaliation. Each action is justified as necessary protection, yet collectively these actions create an environment of permanent tension. Instead of improving safety, this process multiplies suspicion and raises the risk of confrontation through miscalculation or political pressure. Fear becomes a powerful political tool within this cycle. Leaders use external threats to unify domestic audiences, rally public support, and silence opposition. When people are afraid, they are more likely to accept extraordinary measures, higher military budgets, and restrictions on civil liberties. Public debate becomes narrower, and critical questions about cost, effectiveness, and long term consequences are pushed aside. Fear simplifies complex international issues into narratives of us versus them, reducing diplomacy to a contest of strength rather than problem solving. This atmosphere directly benefits the arms industry and defense contractors. As tensions rise, governments rush to modernize weapons systems, expand military infrastructure, and secure new technologies. These decisions generate massive profits for private corporations that depend on continued instability to sustain demand. The more insecure the world appears, the stronger the justification for new contracts and larger budgets. This creates a structural incentive to maintain conflict narratives where peace becomes economically inconvenient and war readiness becomes financially rewarding. Political elites also gain advantages from militarization. Demonstrating toughness on foreign policy can boost approval ratings, distract from domestic failures, and provide a sense of control in uncertain times. Instead of addressing inequality, unemployment, healthcare shortages, or education reform, leaders shift attention to external threats. Military posturing becomes a substitute for effective governance, allowing politicians to project strength without solving internal problems that require long term commitment and social investment. At the international level, this cycle undermines trust and cooperation. When nations view each other primarily through a military lens, diplomatic channels weaken, agreements become harder to negotiate, and compromise is framed as weakness. Regional organizations and international institutions struggle to function effectively when member states prioritize strategic rivalry over shared goals. As cooperation declines, global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and economic instability receive less coordinated attention, even though they pose far greater risks to human security than most military standoffs. The normalization of militarized responses also reshapes public expectations. Citizens begin to accept military action as a routine policy tool rather than a last resort. Defense spending becomes politically untouchable, while social programs face constant scrutiny and budget cuts. Over time, societies become conditioned to view force as the default solution to international disputes, reinforcing the belief that security can only be achieved through dominance rather than mutual understanding. This feedback loop is dangerous because it reduces flexibility and increases the likelihood of escalation. When every move is interpreted as hostile, leaders feel pressured to respond aggressively to avoid appearing weak. Diplomatic off ramps disappear, replaced by rigid positions and public commitments that are difficult to reverse without political cost. In such an environment, even small incidents can spiral into major confrontations, driven less by necessity and more by the momentum of fear and competition. True security is often misunderstood as the accumulation of military power, yet history and experience show that weapons alone do not create lasting safety. Real security is rooted in stability, trust, and the material well being of people. When societies are economically secure, politically inclusive, and socially supported, they are far less likely to engage in conflict. Cooperation and justice form the foundation of durable peace because they address the underlying conditions that lead to tension in the first place. Diplomacy plays a central role in this process. Open communication channels reduce misunderstandings and allow disagreements to be resolved before they escalate into crises. When nations invest in dialogue instead of threats, they create opportunities for compromise and mutual benefit. Diplomatic engagement does not mean abandoning national interests. It means pursuing those interests through negotiation rather than coercion. By prioritizing talks, mediation, and multilateral forums, countries can transform rivalry into structured cooperation. Economic fairness is another pillar of genuine security. Large gaps in wealth and development between nations often generate resentment, instability, and competition. When trade relationships are built on exploitation rather than mutual benefit, they create long term tensions that eventually surface in political and military disputes. Fair trade practices, debt relief, and development partnerships help reduce these imbalances. When countries feel economically respected and supported, they are more likely to cooperate and less likely to resort to confrontation. Regional development also strengthens peace. Investments in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and technology create opportunities that reduce the appeal of extremism and conflict. When young people have access to jobs, skills training, and social mobility, they are less vulnerable to political manipulation and militarized narratives. Development transforms security from a military concept into a human centered one, focused on improving daily life rather than preparing for war. Justice, both within and between nations, is equally essential. International systems that apply rules selectively undermine trust and legitimacy. When powerful countries are seen as immune to accountability, while weaker nations face strict enforcement, resentment grows. A more balanced global order, where laws and agreements are applied consistently, creates a sense of fairness that supports stability. Justice reduces the perception that force is the only way to protect national interests. Cooperation also enables collective responses to shared global challenges. Climate change, pandemics, food insecurity, and technological risks cannot be solved by any single country acting alone. These issues threaten human security more directly than many traditional military threats. When nations collaborate on research, resource sharing, and crisis response, they strengthen global resilience and reduce the likelihood that scarcity and competition will turn into conflict. Redefining security in this way requires a shift in political priorities. Governments must be willing to invest in social programs, international partnerships, and long term development rather than relying primarily on military spending. This approach does not eliminate the need for defense, but it places it within a broader framework that values prevention over reaction and cooperation over confrontation. By building systems based on shared prosperity and mutual respect, societies can move away from fear driven policies and toward a model of security that protects not just borders, but people, communities, and future generations. The world stands at a crossroads where the choices made by governments, institutions, and societies will shape the direction of global history. One path leads toward short term domination, where nations prioritize power, control, and strategic advantage above all else. This approach emphasizes military strength, economic pressure, and political influence as the primary tools of international engagement. It offers immediate gains for those at the top, but it carries long term costs that threaten global stability and human survival. Short term domination thrives on competition rather than cooperation. It encourages countries to view one another as obstacles instead of partners, transforming diplomacy into a zero sum game. When one nation gains, another is expected to lose. This mindset fuels arms races, trade wars, and geopolitical rivalries that drain resources and deepen global divisions. Instead of solving shared problems, governments become locked in cycles of retaliation and escalation, constantly reacting to perceived threats rather than building sustainable solutions. The alternative path focuses on long term sustainability and collective survival. This vision recognizes that humanity is interconnected through economic systems, environmental challenges, and technological networks. No country can isolate itself from climate change, global health crises, or financial instability. Cooperation becomes not just a moral choice, but a practical necessity. By investing in shared research, international institutions, and coordinated policy responses, nations can reduce risks that no military force can eliminate. Environmental sustainability highlights this contrast clearly. Militarized competition often accelerates resource extraction and environmental degradation as nations race to secure energy supplies and raw materials. This behavior intensifies climate change, water scarcity, and biodiversity loss, creating new sources of conflict. A cooperative approach, on the other hand, promotes renewable energy, conservation, and sustainable development. These efforts protect ecosystems while reducing the likelihood of future resource based conflicts. Technological advancement also reflects this choice. When innovation is driven by rivalry, it often prioritizes surveillance, cyber warfare, and weaponization. When guided by cooperation, it can focus on healthcare, clean energy, education, and infrastructure. The direction technology takes depends on political priorities. A world centered on domination channels creativity into instruments of control, while a world focused on sustainability uses innovation to improve quality of life and global resilience. Social stability is another key dimension. Domination based systems tend to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few, increasing inequality both within and between nations. This concentration fuels unrest, migration pressures, and political polarization. Sustainable models emphasize inclusive growth, fair labor standards, and access to essential services. When people feel economically secure and socially valued, societies become more stable and less susceptible to conflict driven narratives. Choosing sustainability does not mean abandoning national interests. It means redefining them in a broader context that recognizes shared survival as a core priority. Long term prosperity depends on peaceful cooperation, strong institutions, and responsible leadership. The decisions made today regarding military spending, environmental policy, economic partnerships, and diplomatic engagement will determine whether future generations inherit a world shaped by endless rivalry or one built on collaboration and balance,